Next week, we have our CCTSI Accords Community Engagement Forum. We continue our Learning Health Systems seminar series on October 11th. We will generally be having this seminar series on the second Monday of each month. And next month, we welcome Mark Williams from Geisinger. In November, we have our Qualitative and Mixed Methods Research Workshop. And if you've ever attended our Colorado Pragmatic Research and Health Conference, our next one will be held May 23rd, 24th, and 25th of next spring. So with that, I'll turn it over to our speakers for our talk today.
All right, well, thank you all. So I'm going to start off. This is Heather Gilmartin with our talk, and I appreciate everyone spending lunch with us, which is so kind, or wherever you are, maybe later lunch. So next slide. So we have 3 objectives today. Excuse me, 4 objectives. We're going to describe the facts and fiction regarding learning health systems. We're going to explain the historical context and aspirational goals of learning health systems. We're going to illustrate persistent implementation challenges within these systems, and then discuss a framework to achieve the aspirational goals of a fully mature learning health system. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So I decided to do this in a different way instead of the classic sort of lecture approach. So I want you to think about these questions and in your head answer them. Is this a fact or fiction? And then we'll go through it. So fact or fiction, there is one definition for a learning health system. What do you guys think? So let's move to the next slide. So I think this is a fact. The definition, nice, thank you. The definition most cited for learning health systems is this one from the 2015 IOM Learning Health Systems Series report. And what it says is it's defined as, a learning health system is defined as science, informatics, incentives, and culture are aligned for continuous improvement and innovation with best practices seamlessly embedded in the delivery process and new knowledge captured as an integral byproduct of the delivery experience. You know, learning health systems, the idea is that they're bringing theory and data into the practical world of healthcare, where we must do something with this knowledge, right? And we live in an interdependent world, and learning health systems recognize and amplify this reality. Next slide. However, that is an enormous amount of words. And if you have a grant or a word or a paper where there's limited word count, you can also abbreviate this. And there are examples all over the place, but one that I've used is that a learning health system harnesses data and analytics to learn from every patient and feed the knowledge to clinicians to implement with high reliability. So you would be using the same citation with that one if you want to go. Next slide. So the next question is, learning health systems are a new idea. Fact or fiction? All right, next slide. The answer is fiction. The reason we propose this as a fiction is because learning health systems were initially proposed by the Institute of Medicine in a 2006 workshop. So they're about 15 years old, so not brand new. However, they combine work from many fields. So there have been suggestions, it's just a new name that brings together lots of established practices. The move towards learning health systems was made possible by the widespread adoption of electronic health records and the advanced computing technologies that came around in the early 2000s. So when people debate the differences, and there are lots of debate going on out there around learning health systems and quality, continuous quality improvement, for example, thought leaders in the field respond that learning health systems bring together data and analytic technologies with continuous quality improvement methods, dissemination and implementation science methods, improvement science methods, behavior change science, community-based participatory research methods, and the other fields on this slide, and there are lots of them. So the reason we went with fiction in this is that we feel it's a relatively new name that pulls together many fields of science. Next slide. And if you're interested in reading the original work on learning health systems, the IOM published multiple reports that explain the role of the digital infrastructure, digital data priorities, observational studies, trials, and engaging citizens to support a learning health system. But be warned, they are each about 500 pages. So be ready for a long read. Next slide, please. And next question. So learning health systems researchers, are they a real thing? Is this something that we can put on our business cards? So what do you guys think, fact or fiction? So let's go to the answer. And the answer is, I think it's a fact. So AHRQ has defined a learning health system researcher, and they define that as an individual who is embedded within a health system and collaborates with its stakeholders to produce novel insights and evidence that can be rapidly implemented to improve the outcomes of individuals and populations and health systems performance. So the key points are that the researcher is embedded within a health system and collaborates with stakeholders and rapidly implements to improve outcomes. So to me, this is a fact. For many of us meet this definition, though I don't have it on my business card. I will get one day. We can find this type of clinical and health services researcher in traditional academic settings, like at universities. However, I think they are most commonly found in integrated systems such as the Veterans Health Administration, Kaiser, Mayo, and the Children's Hospital systems as well. Next slide, please. So the next question, are there model learning health systems? Do they exist? Fact or fiction? So next slide. So this one I say is a fact. One in particular that is consistently highlighted is the Veterans Health Administration. So the VA was one of many case studies that was discussed in the original IOM report. And this was due to the electronic health record and data infrastructure work that had been started in like the early 1990s in the VA. Since that time, the VA has openly committed to becoming a learning health system and has published many papers, with some of them being on the slide, on how this has been done, why it's been done, how to develop learning health system researchers, and then the many benefits of learning health systems. Next slide, please. And the last question. There is one standard model for learning health systems, fact or fiction. And the reason I pose this is, as with most system science topics, it is a complex idea, so best presented in some sort of image. And I would say that is a big fiction because there are dozens and dozens of models out there attempting to explain in simple language. So this is one of the great models that was created to represent the learning health system. And this one was included in the original IOM report. And it shows how evidence and science should inform clinical care in a continuous cycle, with culture, incentives, and leadership providing support for patients, clinicians, and communities. And then the next slide, this model was published in 2012 by Sarah Green in Annals of Internal Medicine. And the model describes an evolving learning health system at Group Health in Seattle. And the model presents the learning health system as a circle that flows in 6 distinct phases, and I'll explain those. It starts with identifying a problem and potential innovative solutions, and then it moves through designing care and evaluation based on evidence, then implementing a plan of care project, then evaluating the project, and then adjusting the project using evidence, and then sharing the results through presentations, publications, and other methods. And essentially then you rinse and you repeat. These authors suggest that what makes learning health systems research different than traditional health systems work is there is an expectation for change. Change is where the action happens. And that can either be a research study or a quality improvement type project. And next slide. And then the third model I'll share has been attributed to Charles Friedman from the University of Michigan. And the model presents a learning health system as an integration of evidence and practice, where evidence informs practice and practice informs evidence. And it explains the phases like the model proposed by Sarah Green. But what I like about this one is that it calls out which phases are primarily technical, data assembly, data analysis, and interpretation, and which phases are primarily relational and require interdisciplinary engagement. And the Green and Friedman models encourage us to think of the healthcare system as a laboratory, where we are constantly engaging and using existing data to improve care versus passive approaches of one-off studies that end when the funding goes away. Because the ultimate goal of learning health systems is to decrease the evidence to practice translation from 17 years to 17 months, weeks, or days. So that is the end of the fact and fiction round. And now I will hand it off to Dr. Trinkley, who will take on the next topic.
Thank you. So as Dr. Gilmartin mentioned, the goal of a learning health system is to achieve practice generating research in which research informs practice and practice informs research. However, achieving this symbiotic relationship is hard for many reasons, including the fundamental issue of health systems are inherently complex and dynamic. There are so many well-known challenges learning health systems face. Some of these are more or less challenging depending on the setting and available expertise and resources available to a given learning health system. Some of these notable challenges learning health systems face include insufficient support from the system or policy level, including things such as financial or monetary reimbursement that supports the learning culture, or insufficient formalized training programs to build a workforce capable of carrying out the learning health system mission. Certainly overlap with the first challenge. Another limitation is lack of resources available to carry out the learning health system activities. And this could be in the form of time, certainly, but it can also be in the form of personnel or tangible resources such as access to data. And when you think about access to data, it's not just having timely, readily available data, it's having data in the right formats so that the data is actionable and able to be used and transformed to create meaningful information. And that data also needs to be inclusive. So oftentimes learning health systems may struggle in getting the right type of data that is holistic and representative of the data they need to make care decisions for the health of patients. In terms of expertise, many learning health systems speak to the need for diverse methodologic and analytic expertise to conduct learning cycles within the learning health systems. Also limited by time and resources available to conduct stakeholder engagement is another challenge. But beyond the time required to conduct the stakeholder engagement, many learning health systems point to the fact that there's insufficient engagement of certain stakeholders, notably from patients and community members who are either directly or indirectly impacted by learning health systems. What we do generally a very good job of is getting the input from health system leaders and frontline clinicians and staff, but oftentimes for a variety of reasons, we struggle getting enough input from patients and community members. Another notable challenge is a lack of shared mission across the different perspectives of research and clinical enterprises. So for example, researchers might see the bigger picture. They might know the evidence and be frustrated that the evidence isn't being translated and applied in clinical practice. Whereas clinicians, they may not recognize the different challenges and stresses and day-to-day difficulties that clinicians and frontline staff face in trying to, one, identify the evidence and translate it into clinical practice. So there's definitely, at times, a bit of butting heads between the different perspectives. Despite the complexities and challenges, there are many examples of existing learning health systems. And each of these learning health systems looks very different. And in general, they could be categorized or bucketed into 3 different types or models. One of which is more of a centralized model. And centralized model includes a formal governance structure and standard procedures for prioritizing issues within a health system that then are used to conduct learning cycles on. For those issues that are prioritized by the central governance structure, they offer resources and support in the form of expertise to conduct the learning cycles. In other words, the centralized model oftentimes has something like a committee that vets different projects, and for those that are prioritized, it offers support to conduct the different learning cycles. I have a picture of the Vanderbilt University Medical Center here because they have an excellent paper describing their process for doing this. Another type of learning health system or model is more decentralized. Decentralized learning health systems are often the form of data networks. And what they do is they pool data from different data sources and settings that can be readily used and analyzed by other health systems. However, they don't always have the methodologic or analytic expertise needed to use the data, and that might be on the shoulders of the individual health system that wants to use that data. Another important consideration with the decentralized models is that the data may not always be fully relevant to another health system's very unique context. Some examples of decentralized models are PedsNet and PCORnet, which are examples of data networks representative of pediatric patients. And then another example that's actually led here locally in Colorado is the DARTnet. Oh, looks like I was muted. The final type of learning health system model is functions somewhat like a consultancy. And so these are often housed within academic medical centers and offer extensive methodologic and analytic expertise. However, sometimes they might be limited if they're not a standard part of a health system's learning cycle and clinical operations. But these types of services often have the advantage of being able to be offered outside of the health system and help other contexts. I think it's really important to point out that there are no perfect examples of learning health systems. They all have their pros and cons, but they do what they can with what they have. You know, lots of times I think we tend to say, oh, well, they're not a true learning health system because of X, Y, and Z. But it's important to note that being a learning health system is not all or nothing. Depending on what they're able to do, learning health systems really fall along a spectrum of maturity. And there are many examples of learning health systems across the spectrum of maturity. To this effect, Lannon et al. Has recently published and created a maturity grid. And this particular maturity grid is informed by the work of the National Academy of Medicine and other experts. And it can be used by learning health systems to evaluate the maturity of their specific model. And it can also be helpful to guide further development along the spectrum of maturity. So where do we need to go? Where we need to go really boils down to being persistent. A fully mature learning health system is truly an aspirational goal and a moving target. There are constantly rapidly emerging innovations in data, technology, evidence, and best practices that require us to adapt, meaning the learning health system will always be an aspiration. And sure, as soon as I tell you it's aspirational, it becomes daunting and your reaction might be to tune out. But it's reality, and there's so much to do to keep up and ensure that we're doing the best for the lives of the people who trust us. And really, this aspiration and working towards this aspiration is a commitment to the quadruple aim and a commitment to excellence in quality, value, efficiency, and providing equitable healthcare. So in order to capture the complexity of learning health systems and to provide direction on how to address the ongoing challenges and insight on where we need to go, we've created a framework that can be used by health systems, including here at UC Health, in our efforts to achieve the aspirational goals of a fully mature learning health system. And before I go any further, I want to clearly point out the contributions and collaborations from Drs. Hipschman, Glasgow, and Ho in creating this framework. And so I'm going to walk you through this framework, spend a little bit of time walking through it to give you a better understanding of what's involved in the ideal visionary concept of a learning health system. And I want to point out that with few exceptions, this framework is not novel, and it simply integrates the work from others. However, I will clearly articulate those aspects that are potentially unique to this framework. First, the central aspect of all learning health systems is the learning cycle, which is where the work is done. It's where the action is, as Dr. Gilmartin mentioned. And so these learning cycles focus on rapidly and iteratively identifying and problem-solving issues. In the framework that we pose, the learning cycle is depicted on the far left of the figure. And this part of the figure builds on the classic learning health system model created by Greens that Dr. Gilmartin previously showed you. In this model, there's a scan internally and externally to identify problems and inform problems, which then undergo design, implementation, and evaluation phases, as well as adjustment phase. And in this adjustment phase, it really emphasizes the iterative nature of learning cycles. Finally, a core aspect of learning cycles is disseminating the findings internally and externally so that others can benefit from the findings. Improvement background might also notice the parallel to the classic PDSA cycle. And this particular conceptualization of the PDSA cycle was created by Kaiser Permanente in Washington. And so QI, quality improvement, is a critical aspect of learning health systems, which is represented in this figure, our framework, alongside the terms used by Green. So as you can see on our framework, plan is next to design, do, study, and act. So really the research and the quality improvement come together in this framework. An overarching principle of learning health systems and this framework is a systems thinking approach, which is necessary to capture the complexity and dynamic changes and interactions of the system. As such, the framework also builds on the classic socio-ecologic model and is depicted as a Venn diagram in which mature learning health systems include active, ongoing stakeholder engagement across all levels. Engagement and support at each of these levels aims to provide different types of critical support and input for learning cycles and the overarching learning health system model, which I'll briefly walk us through. So when you think about the organizational level, key contributions and perspectives include forging a shared vision of that relationship between evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence, as well as integrating transdisciplinary stakeholders, including patients, with an equity lens to promote health equity. And of course, there's a need for organizational prioritization of resources and data needed to support the learning health system. The organization needs to invest in the resources needed to carry out learning health systems. When you think about the community level, key contributions and perspectives include creating new partnerships across healthcare settings, but also between healthcare settings and others, such as technology partners and community-based programs, and aligning goals and priorities across these different sectors. And creation of things like health information exchanges to share data, and joining with community organizations such as Odyssey to harmonize data, create data standards so that data is able to be transformed and into usable, actionable formats. Engagement at the policy level is key to capacity building via regulatory actions and quality standards, but also through financial reimbursement mechanisms that support not only volume, not only value, but also support learning. Also capacity building by supporting training and education programs to develop a workforce that's capable of carrying out the mission of learning health systems. However, engagement at this level is less common. Distinct from engagement across these different levels, the overarching learning health system model or governance structure can function at really any of these levels. And so over the course of this seminar series, you will hear firsthand from a number of outside folks about the organization and operations of different learning health system models, each of which functions and looks very different. When you think about specific examples at the policy level, a couple examples could include the Swiss model or PCORnet. The Swiss model is a developing learning health system at the national level, whereas PCORnet, I mentioned, is more of a data network. An example at the community level is ADAPT. And ADAPT aims to connect at-risk youth in the juvenile justice system with mental health services in 8 different areas of Indiana. Now, this particular learning health system, you could also argue, might be at the policy level because it's state level. So there's certainly overlap in really where they fit within the socio-ecologic framework. Where we see most learning health systems is more at the organization level. And so some familiar examples at this level include Geisinger, Vanderbilt, University of Michigan, Washington, Virginia, and of course, Kaiser. I am excited to say that next month, as was mentioned, we will be having Dr. Mark Williams join us and discussing the Geisinger model. So although there are fewer examples of learning health systems at higher levels of the socio-ecologic spectrum, specifically the policy level, when there is a learning health system at that level, the population health impact is anticipated to be much greater, as is the potential for the sustainability of the learning health system and the findings from the learning cycles. However, when conducted at higher levels of the socio-ecologic spectrum, there are oftentimes the change, so the rapidity might be slower. The final aspect of this framework that I want to review are the key components or concepts or methods that should be used together during the different learning cycles. The first is informatics, which includes the tangible data, software, technology, and certainly things like artificial intelligence and clinical prediction models, but it also includes the expertise, as well as the standards and ontologies that make data shareable and usable. Along with informatics is precision health or precision medicine, which calls for inclusive integration of holistic data sources that impact health and allow for individualized care. I want to note that to achieve the goal of precision health, we need to consider data sources beyond what is currently available in the electronic health record. And it's no surprise that stakeholder engagement is also an important component of the learning cycles. Stakeholder engagement should be representative across the socio-ecologic spectrum of those that it directly and indirectly impacts, and stakeholder engagement should be iterative to account for the dynamic and rapid changes that occur within healthcare. As I already mentioned, quality improvement is certainly central to learning health systems. It brings a culture of improvement and iterative methods that are contextually relevant for a setting or health system. However, QI can be limited by generalizability. Thus, when merged with pragmatic approaches, quality improvement can be elevated and be externally generalizable. Pragmatic methods and outcome measures are both practical and robust and prioritize specific issues related to relevance to stakeholders, rapidity and recursiveness of findings, the replicability or reproducibility by others, rigor in real-world, heterogeneous, messy situations, and it considers the feasibility and practicality of resources required. Last but not least, this framework includes integration of dissemination and implementation science, or D&I science. With its focus on external validity, D&I science increases the likelihood and the speed of translating evidence into practice. It also provides guidance on how to maximize dissemination, among many other things. As framed by the book Steal Like an Artist, no idea is original, and we absolutely stole like artists to create this framework. The framework we presented is largely the product of integrating the work from others. However, there are some unique features of this framework, including D&I science. While others certainly use D&I science in their learning health systems, this framework formally integrates its methods and approaches with the other well-known methods. used in learning health systems. This framework also prioritized some under-recognized challenges that learning health systems face. These particular challenges are sustainability and generalizability, which are issues that D&I science really emphasizes as well. And although I didn't have time to describe it in depth, this model also aims to provide guidance on how learning health systems can promote health equity, notably by including inclusive precision health that comprehensively and holistically integrates data that impacts care decisions. So considering things such as behavioral and environmental data, as well as patient-reported outcomes and social determinants of health that are not necessarily and oftentimes not included in our traditional data sources of electronic health records. The other way that this framework tries to promote health equity is by emphasizing the importance of representativeness of stakeholders. So not just engaging stakeholders who represent the norm or the average voice or opinion, but making sure that stakeholders are engaged across the socioecologic spectrum and that represents the voice of outliers and those that have historically been marginalized. So in summary, I recognize that this was a lightning speed overview of learning health systems. And you surely have many lines of inquiry, but I hope you see how becoming a truly mature learning health system is an aspirational goal and that it's worth our persistence. It gives us a mark to strive for and do better. And while many have already made tremendous progress towards the aspiration, many challenges remain, but we can look at these challenges and find opportunities in them. Notable opportunities include advocating for changes in culture and policy. One specific area that really needs work is identifying reimbursement mechanisms that support the core tenets of a learning health system, the learning, not just the value aspect or volume certainly, but the learning aspect. And also advocating for transdisciplinary engagement across sectors, not just within the healthcare system, and integration of diverse perspectives and expertise. As this seminar pushes forward, you will have an opportunity to learn about different learning health system models, their experiences in developing and maturing their model, and we'll do some deep dives into some of the different methods and concepts that different learning health systems have employed. So with that, we have worked hard, and I think that we have succeeded in carving out ample time for discussion today. So with that, I'd like to thank Accords and for this opportunity and for all of you for tuning in. And we'd love to have a hearty discussion about learning health systems and hear your perspectives.
And so this is Heather. If you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can put the question into the chat box and I can read it to the group. Katy, maybe if you want to stop sharing your screen and we can all sort of see each other. Your talk was super interesting, and what made you think that we need another framework, right, for learning health systems?
Yes, so especially in the world of D&I science, we like theories, models, and frameworks. And there's the ultimate question of, do we really need another one? And you know, it's not necessarily that I think we need another model or framework. I think that there does, one of the impetus for creating this new conceptual visualization, let's call it, of a learning health system is the need to raise awareness of the integral contributions of dissemination and implementation science and what it brings forth to a learning health system. So I think more than anything, it's an update of what currently exists and adding some additional concepts to it.
No, I like that. I mean, I think the biggest challenge I've run into is so complex, And sometimes it's helpful to have someone else pull it all together so you can check the boxes as you go through your work. So does anyone have any questions? Feel free to unmic yourself. I know Dr. Kwan, you had some questions lined up as well. Dr. Kemp asks, can you comment on the ways different learning health systems do support the learning, especially given the usual divide between the slow pace of research funding and the needs for systems to get rapid answers?
That's an excellent question. And so currently, I would say that to support the learning, so some health systems have created hard funding for their learning health systems, meaning that there is top-down and bidirectional support for the learning health system. Vanderbilt is one prime example where there's hard funding for it. So they're not necessarily required to have, our typical clinical reimbursement that also prioritizes learning. Another method is there are a number of training programs that are starting to be developed. And certainly AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, has created training programs, K-12 specifically, to support a workforce capable of the learning health system mission. But beyond formal training programs and hard funding, I'm not aware of really any other approaches to support that learning aspect. Great question.
So I can add in from the Veterans Health Administration, we've been pioneers in this area for quite some time because our mission is to care for the veteran and we need to take our science instantly into the field. So the group is called the Quality Enhancement Research Initiative. We call it QUERI, Q-U-E-R-I. And if you Google that, there is learning hubs that have been established that teach everything from designing for dissemination to teamwork and collaboration to facilitation, key aspects that are used within the learning health system. And they are free for obviously VA employees, but also for others to join. And so I would encourage accessing some of these resources. Also then the plethora of publications that are out there that have come from so many arenas. I also would look to places outside of the US. The UK is doing a beautiful job with this work along with Canada. And they have, now in the Zoom world, there are people on here from other countries besides the US. So, it's best sometimes to just, if you Google learning health systems training, you might be surprised how many talks are posted. There might even be some TED Talks out there to just sort of get out of your comfort zone of the academic setting to see what you can take away.
And of course, this is just the first of our seminar series focused on this topic this year. We also have some talks from our most recent CopperCon, and I can put the link into CopperCon from this year. We had a number of really excellent talks touching upon learning health systems, pragmatic research methods, and so I'd encourage you to make use of those archives as well.
I'm going to read this one.
And a question about.
Go ahead.
I was just going to add, so other resources for this type of training. So Indiana University, Regan Street, also offers a certificate program, and they combine D&I science with learning health systems. So that's an opportunity. Of course, I have to say here at CU, we have a certificate program for implementation science as well, which touches on many of the tenets of learning health system. But there's also the University of Michigan hosts very good learning health system general presentations as well.
One of the questions I wanted to ask to anyone on the call, actually. So it says, are we familiar with any studies that have particularly identified either how to integrate multi-stakeholder perspectives into performance measures and how to make data more actionable via organizational changes? And that is like the million-dollar question. So Dr. Kwan or maybe Dr. Hubschman and Dr. Trinkley, any thoughts?
I think that the stakeholder engagement, sorry, go ahead.
Katy, Bethany, why don't you go ahead?
So I think from a data usability perspective that stakeholder engagement throughout the process of designing, interpreting, disseminating findings from research is critically important in the process. You want to be focusing on actionable data from the very beginning. And for that, you need to have been engaging the health system leaders, the health system stakeholders, so that you understand what challenges they are facing, so that the questions you're asking, the data that you're gathering can be directly relevant and informative to the types of clinical decisions, operational and administrative decisions that they are making. So it starts at the very beginning, that you're oriented towards the problems that that health system is seeking to better understand.
Is there anyone, Dr. Kwan, who's particularly leading this field that who has published in this area?
In
the multi-stakeholder engagement piece. I know Don Neese has done a lot of fantastic work at CU. Is there anyone else who would be considered sort of the topical expert?
I think it's such a broad topic area that there isn't maybe one particular person. I've done some work in this area. I think many people have done work in this area. And certainly, as Katie mentioned, there's major learning health system work happening throughout the country, and we're having a number of speakers come speak on that topic this year. Does anyone else have any favorites or recommendations they would make for who to look for?
I will put a plug out for a great resource in that area. The National Cancer Institute just put out a website full of references and resources of how to conduct multi-level stakeholder engagement. Also, Dr. Kwan has put together a nice interactive website that can inform which approach to stakeholder engagement you use based on the resources you have available, which is wonderful. In terms of learning health systems and an example of integrating multi-level stakeholder engagement within learning health systems, there are actually a number of papers that describe their process. I will say that at times it might not be to the depth or the iterative nature that might be ideal, but there are examples. So Vanderbilt, again, their paper, I keep going back to it because I love their paper, but they describe in detail how they get stakeholders to the table. There's really a formalized process for this, and they make sure that all those boxes, most of the boxes are checked in terms of who comes to the table at regularly defined meetings. Connect Health in the UK is another example where they really focus on involving the community members as well as more of a national stakeholder representation as well. So there are definitely many examples.
And I would also up as well that the University of Michigan has a Learning Health Systems journal, which is open access and online. And that is actually an interesting table of contents to review because originally a lot of it came out, it was theories and frameworks and sort of data approaches. And now they're moving more into, as this field has matured, into practical examples. So I would encourage you to go looking through the syllabus or the table of contents there. So another question that was posed, Katie, could you give an example from one of the centralized government structure LHSs as to what they have prioritized? Do any of these priorities relate to the ability to be rewarded, avoid CMS penalties for worse outcomes?
Fantastic question from Dr. Hipschman. So specific examples, I can just rattle off a number of them. So there's sepsis management, there's antimicrobial stewardship initiatives. There are certainly examples in the primary care space for chronic disease management. I can't think of one specific example that's aligned with value-based reimbursement metric or CMS metric. I do know that they exist. I just can't put my finger on one particular paper that describes that. But I do think it brings up a really important point and something that I've been noodling on quite a bit lately, which is, I think one of the advantages of a learning health system is it takes us away from our priority, especially in primary care, on these predefined value-based reimbursement metrics at the sake and sacrifice of other very important evidence-based practices and interventions. The learning health system approach allows us to prioritize things other than just those very specific defined metrics that are tied to money. So I think that that's another advantage of the learning health system.
And I can share that I worked on a paper with two colleagues, Vincent Hsu from Kaiser Permanente in Northwest, and then Bob Burke out in Philadelphia. And we went looking from a hospitalist perspective on an active learning health system, like at the ground level. And Kaiser does one of the best in their sepsis program, which started over a decade ago. And they continue to evolve it in that they went from sepsis alerts inpatient to sepsis alerts, preventative, to sepsis alerts now in the outpatient setting. And so it takes, though, so to your question around being rewarded for it, Kaiser is a system that is constantly looking to improve care, but to also decrease costs. That is the prime rich ground in which learning health systems grow. Unfortunately, CMS doesn't provide those incentives, but it doesn't mean they won't. So it's something to keep aspiring to in non sort of group health settings. And then let's see, moving on. There's a question, can you comment on any national funding trends in this area other than the AHR, KU, K-12?
I am not aware personally of other funding trends beyond the AHRQ. So AHRQ is K-12 in training programs, but also in general, sometimes they do have announcements specifically related to some aspects of a learning health system separate from training. I'm not sure if others are aware of other opportunities.
I mean, I would say that the learning health system as a grant, it's almost like you're looking at it as a big picture, and you can say, this is the aspect of the learning health system within my field that I am tackling, because you're not going to take on the whole aspect, but it allows you to demonstrate that your work is part of something bigger, a transformation in healthcare. And I think that that's how you can link them together. So you may be applying, to the mental health group for grant funds there, but you should bring in the idea that you're within a larger cycle that is using existing data, right, to analyze and then evaluate, learn, and keep growing. So I think you can use this within any funding mechanism.
And Dr. Hirschman, you had an interesting comment about the grid-enabled measure. Do you want to comment on that?
Just to say that it is a database that was developed in part to try to harmonize data structure and have common data elements. So I don't know that it's not perfect, but it does have efforts to bring together a lot of standardized assessments of different patient level outcomes or other types of outcomes.
And then Dr. Kwan has actually put into the chat box a paper from work with one of their distributed data networks on how they engage clinical and operational stakeholders in a project to implement patient-reported outcomes, for those who are interested. So we have about 3 more minutes before we'll allow you guys time to do the evaluation. So opportunity for 1 or 2 last questions.
Did you answer Amy's question about an example of a centralized governance structure? Did you touch on that one?
I am looking for that question.
So Katy, could you give an example from one of the centralized governance structure learning health systems as to what they have prioritized? And do any of those priorities relate to the ability to be rewarded, that is, avoid CMS penalties for worse outcomes?
Yeah, and I think that that goes to, there are many examples. So sepsis is an example that Dr. Gilmartin and I mentioned. Certainly chronic disease management, many examples across the spectrum, both inpatient and outpatient. Some aligned with reimbursement metrics, some not, which I think, again, is a very great advantage of the learning health system model. You're not confined to prioritizing what you're paid for.
But at the same time, it can be easier to invest in infrastructure and resources when the outcomes data that you're seeking to analyze is nicely aligned with metrics that the organization's already needing to collect and respond to. It's a nice example of aligning the motivations and the interests and the mission. And so I typically start there. I start with what are the metrics that the organization needs to report to their payers, to various funding entities, to regulatory entities. It's the easiest place to start, but it shouldn't be the end. It shouldn't be the final step in figuring out what really does matter to, you made the point, patient stakeholders and community stakeholders. Those are not necessarily the outcomes that matter to patients. And so you want to make sure that you're not, as Katy said, restricted to what those quality metrics are, but at the same time, it gives you a place to start.
And actually, I think that's a great way to end it, in the sense that what I've seen in my own work is that data can be very informative at an organization level, but not actionable. And so it often moves into what we'll be discussing for the rest of this seminar series around what are the methods that can give you the data to actually make change and then detect the subtle changes, because we know in the Swiss cheese model that we're sure as heck not going to make an error, right? So if we're just looking at it as an error that we're trying to prevent, we need to find some better metrics. So I think the topic is large and will probably be touched on throughout this whole seminar series. So Victoria, I believe you already put the evaluation in the chat, but if people would be willing to share with us their feedback, suggestions for other topics in the last couple of minutes. And yes, we will share the slides, and the recording will be posted on the Accords website later this week. And then there was another comment I think thrown in here. Learning Health Systems can think about payers as key partners. Information from Learning Health Systems can be used to inform payers' policies.
Sorry to interrupt, Heather. Victoria, can you put the link in the chat again, just so people can grab it before they go? Thank you.
And I'll also email it out to them as well.
Yes, so you'll all get an email. You only need to do it once. But thank you all for attending today. And as Heather mentioned, we will have the slide deck and the recording up on our Accords website by later this week. And we really appreciate everyone coming, and we hope you return next month. Thank you, everyone.